Hello, everyone. Welcome to this interview for the Open Borders Institute. We are a small advocacy with the goal of changing perspectives at cross-border exchanges. This week, we welcome Helmut Sorge. Hello, Helmut. Helmut is a novelist and a columnist for the Policy Center for the New South. His latest book, A Man in the Shadows, is coming out soon. His greatest success, Goat, is a biography of Muhammad Ali, which he published in 2001, and which has been praised by Barack Obama on TV upon Ali's death in 2016. It now only sells as a limited edition. Amongst his successful books, I would like to mention The Player, a biography of Boris Becker, which is a Sunday Times bestseller, and Fratelli Guida, which was published in Italy and speaks about a group of drug-dealing monks. You can follow his Instagram, Helmut Sorge, to be kept in the loop about his latest publications or on the website of the Policy Center for the New South. Helmut has had a brilliant career as a journalist that spans over at least 2 continents. Presently a resident in Morocco, Helmut is a fluent speaker of French, English, and German, something that has allowed him to live and work over a great deal of many places. I believe that a career like that of Helmut is an inspiration for all of us out there who want to brave new worlds. Thank you, Helmut.
I'm very happy that you gave me such a great introduction and such a great public relation. It is undeserved because there are so many people who are talented, who have no chance and who will not be published because there are so many books on the market. But the important thing is, I think in our discussion, I will dwell into it, is in life you need determination and you need also a great dose of luck. There is so much luck and so much luck is shadowed by tragedy. People who are trying to escape from Africa or other places by boat or by things which supposedly are boats, trying to escape to Europe. Some of them make it, some of them are tragically disappearing. So there is already the very basic part of luck. The luck of where you're born, the luck of how privileged you are by the support of your family or your friends. So even in my life, because you mentioned the career, a very large part of my success, if you want to call it success, has been accompanied by luck. So you need 2 things. You need determination and luck. And you need to know, in my life, I usually knew which I didn't want to do. I didn't always know what to do, but I always knew what I didn't want to do, which way I didn't want to walk. For example, because that's my generation, I never took drugs. I never was tempted by drugs because in my early days, there were no drugs, there was just poverty. And later on, I was not interested in at all. So, and I played a lot of football and I played a lot of tennis. So I never smoked, but that's not luck. That's just your decision on your own life. If you want to be free, you can do with your life whatever you want, as long as you respect the life of others.
So tell me a little bit more about your career. You were a journalist for The Spiegel for many years. Tell me a little bit about the different countries that you've been in, your experiences with that. How did it go from living in Germany to being presently in Morocco?
Yes, it depends on how many hours we have to go into
well,
this.
we have 45 minutes, so
okay, but very briefly. When I mentioned before, I wanted to become, because I was very interested in sport, I wanted to become a sports journalist. I went to the United States very young. I was 18 when I had the chance to go. That was a different time. That was the early 60s of last century, and America was still a different country than today, as it is today. The people apparently were different, or I just didn't see too much of the negative sides. So I was in America, and I was, supported by a lot of people because I didn't have any money, and I was by myself. I immediately knew that if I wanted to survive in America, I would have had to work, and I drove the very classical way of life. I drove a taxi for an airport hotel, bringing stewardesses and pilots to the airport and back. So that's the first step many people do in the United States. Immigrants who come to the United States, they rent in New York a taxi, they pay $100. If they make $90 during the day, they're lost. If they make 150, they have hope. So I was in that same situation, but I was supported by people. And when I wanted to study in the United States, I had the luck also that I drove by one day at Stanford University, which is a very, very famous and expensive university. And the people were playing football, soccer in the United States. And I stopped and I looked, and they were missing one guy to play. And the coach asked me, he was from Scotland, and he asked me, do you know how to play football, soccer? I said, sure, I try. And the first kick I did practically from the corner, I made it go. I was 5 minutes on the pitch. So he said, my God, you're very good. So they hired me as an assistant soccer coach at Stanford. So that was the beginning of my American experience, which restarted later in 1968. I was very young. I was sent by Der Spiegel to Washington. But I was not sent because I was a great expert on the United States, but since I was a war correspondent also before, which means I spent some time in the Middle East during the Six-Day War. I was in the Middle East at that time, and after I met Yasser Arafat, who at that time was called Abu Ammar, and I met a lot of Palestinians like George Habash and others, and I was very much involved in the Middle East conflict. Then I was sent, later to Northern Ireland, and I was very much involved in the Northern Ireland problem. I was very much involved in Guatemala and San Salvador, and later on in Vietnam. So I was a very brave, stupid young journalist because I thought I would never die. Because war correspondent is a very, very unpleasant and very dangerous profession. And I lost two of my very good friends. One was German, he got killed in Uganda. The other one was shot in San Salvador. So I lost two of my very good friends in war. So when I was 26, I was sent to Washington as a correspondent. And I had wonderful experiences. It was the time of Nixon and Spiro Agnew. So I was the first time very young in touch with politics, great politics, I want to say. American politics at that time was Watergate and these things. So I was very young, attached to great political moments. So from there, then I went from there to the place where you are now. I went to London. And I have to say that not because you live in this wonderful place. Those 5 years I spent in London from 71 to 76 were part of my best years of my life, because London at that time in England was, there was a kind of revival, a cultural revival. There were mini skirts, and there were the Rolling Stones, and there were the Beatles, and there was Carnaby Street, and there was King's Road. Everything was new, and everything was wonderful. And that's where I started to play tennis. I started to play tennis in a very, very small club, in Notting Hill, which is a park you know probably. And the people were very nice. And to just as a footnote, if young people ask themselves, if they come into a foreign country, what do they do? How do they integrate into the society? I can only give a very general advice, and that was a very good advice for myself. I participated in sports. So in London, I played tennis at this very small and very nice club. From there, I played in Hurlingham. From there, I played at Queen's. And from there, I went to Wimbledon. I never played in Wimbledon, but I played in some Australian grass court clubs outside of London. And in all these clubs and all these places, I made great people. I met great people. And I also played when I was in London. I played for the Sunday Times. So these were all these guys with whom I played were great Sunday Times writer and the great time of the Sunday Times. So wherever I went in my whole life, even here in Marrakesh, I'm a member of the Royal Tennis Club, and I met wonderful people at the Royal Tennis Club. So if you don't know what to do, you have to go into a group somewhere, whether you do a photo shoot group or you do a walking group, or you have to find people. You have to find the social structure. To believe that you can do it yourself, all by yourself, is an illusion. You know, if you are by yourself, like I was also when I was very young, studying there, I was in Los Angeles for a while, and I was alone. And my first Christmas in the United States, my first Christmas in the United States, I spent by myself, and I was alone, and I was somehow lonely. But I said to myself, "This is what you wanted. Stop starting crying. Do something." So I went to another club, and I met some nice people. So my career from then, from Washington, London, I went then to Paris, which is one of the best cities also you can live in if you have the money. It's very expensive. And the French are much nicer than the people give them credit. The British say, "Oh, the French are fucking frogs," which is maybe the experience of some people. But my experience in France was altogether very positive, and I stayed in France altogether almost 2 decades, and I have met great philosophers like Foucault. I met historians. I met great, interesting French people, the prime ministers and the present foreign secretary of France, Catherine Colonna. I met when I was a young writer in Washington, and she was a very, very young foreign diplomat. So you meet people and you stay in touch, and it's not that difficult if you, as I said at the beginning, if you know what you don't want to do, and if you have an idea of what you'd like to do. I wanted to become a journalist. If I wouldn't have done a journalist, if I wouldn't have done journalism, I would probably have become a hotel manager, because my idea was to discover the world. And I said to myself, so where do I work? And I said, okay, there's the Hilton, and the Hilton is in Frankfurt, and the Hilton is in London, and the Hilton is in New York. I should become a hotel manager if the other career doesn't work out. So from Paris, I went back another time to Washington for 3 years, to the White House. So I have a pretty good idea the craziness of Mr. Trump, how that is playing out. It's a president I certainly don't like and I appreciate, because he is he's a symbol of the America which I don't like at all. But it's not up to me to vote the president, it's for the Americans. So if they're crazy enough to vote for Mr. Trump, that's their choice. People have to do what they want to do, and they are free to just run the country down the drain. But that's not my problem. I'm very sorry for that, but it's not good. So to continue on this voyage, during the time when I was in Paris, I did a lot of trips in the world. I went to big safari huntings, which I don't agree with, but I was there as a writer, not as a hunter. So I followed Hemingway's steps in Africa. I wrote also about the matadors, the bullfighting, which Hemingway also liked, and I didn't like either. But, you know, the life of a writer or a journalist is not to have a judgment and say all is negative. I go there and I look at it. I've been in monasteries. I'm not very religious, but I've been in monasteries, many monasteries, Carteux, Chartreuse, and Trappist and Benedictines. I have seen, and I've stayed there. They never asked me whether I was Catholic. They were very hospitable. And I wrote about their problems and about their, you know, the monasteries have great problems of existence. So they're going down the drain in many ways. And out of this experience in monasteries came my book, Fratelli Guida, you know, the monks on drugs. So wherever you go, there is something to see and to discover. And from that kind of experience, I also worked in Los Angeles for a German TV production for a year, and I wrote books, and I worked for National Public Radio. When very young, I worked for Newsweek. So I gave speeches at Duke University. I gave speeches. I was at the Brookings Institute. So my experience is full of wonderful moments, and naturally also dramatic moments like Vietnam, which is not a very happy experience.
You speak about that experience of Africa and safari in your book, A Man in the Shadows. So it still influences you up until today.
I have to say that the experience, the safaris I went to, which the magazine, Der Spiegel, sent me to, that was at a time where magazines and newspapers were still influential, independent, not run by fashion designers or like Bezos of Amazon, who owns the Washington Post, and a former pharmaceutical company owns the Los Angeles Times. That was a time where journalism was still, let's say, the Washington Post discovering Watergate, and the newspapers and magazines still had a political mission and still had a responsibility towards the society. At least that's what I believed, and I think great writers today still believe. But when I went to the magazine, for the magazine, that was in Zimbabwe, and I was there 4 weeks, and we were allowed to rent a small plane to go really into the bush. And I experienced the Africa, which I always, as a child, I was really, you know, I was very fascinated by Africa because of the wilderness, of the forest, of the animals. I like animals, and I don't like hunting, but I understand why people do this, and sometimes they have to do it. So Africa was the first time I was in confronted by really wild animals. It was not the Kruger National Park, and it was not some safari club in Tanzania, but those were animals which were hunted. And these animals do know instinctively that they are hunted, and they are aggressive if you're not careful. So I had 4 weeks in that experience. As I say again, I am not a great admirer of hunting animals as trophies, but you know, I wrote about it, and people at the magazine were unhappy with my writing because I was not too aggressive against it. You know, it's like when I wrote about monasteries, I'm not religious, but I was not damning these people. You know, they do what they want to do. Freedom is their freedom, and their human freedom. So I was criticized because I was not damning the monks, and I was criticized because I did not crucify hunters, and I was criticized because I didn't crucify matadors. I try to be as neutral as one can be. We are always influenced by something, but I try to be neutral, and I try especially to give people the right to be free and also the right to be wrong. It's who am I to judge you or somebody else about their life? It's not
So,
me, it's up to themselves.
on this question of judging people for their lives, on the question of, possible censorship because of what you say, what was your experience with that being in different countries, navigating different cultures? Yesterday, we've had the very sad news of Salman Rushdie, who was attacked in New York. He was doing a conference about the importance of granting seeker status to writers. Um, what was your experience with that? Do you see the role of the writer as a truth teller? Do you see that as something that is still a job that you can do?
Rushdie is a tragedy, and it is a tragedy not only for the human side, but also it shows how fragile the society has become. That he was not protected anymore. He felt he was free. He lived, and the speech he gave there, he was supposed to give. He didn't even start. He was not accompanied by bodyguards, and it was a little town in New York State. And it's a tragedy because now suddenly everybody feels fragile, as we always feel if Kennedy was assassinated, Martin Luther King was assassinated. It's nothing new in our history. And one always feels that okay, after Kennedy, these things should not happen again. After Martin Luther King, this is evil. Each assassination of some writers, politicians, people said, okay, now we change and this will not happen again. Then a person like myself, born during the Second World War, and I grew up in a great amount of poverty in Germany, like everybody else who lived after the war in nations like Russia or France. People who have suffered. I suffered poverty, and I always thought the only lesson we can draw out of tragedy and misery of the German crime in Europe at that time is that there will never be any wars anymore. If you look at the history of Africa today, there are maybe 15 or 20 wars in Africa at this moment. Different civil wars, and there are some Russians, and there are some Germans, and there are some whoever troops, and you have a terrible war in Ukraine, terrible war in Ukraine, which is terrible because the Russians, of all people, who suffered German violence and German aggression, they should know better than anybody else what aggression means and what devastation of people, innocent people, means. But the point I want to make is, unfortunately, human beings apparently don't learn very much. And they don't draw lessons out of the misery which we have lived through. I always believe, okay, no more wars, I was wrong. No more assassinations, I was wrong. I have been wrong so often because I still believe in human fraternity and human understanding, because I have experienced humanity. People have been, all my life, people have been supportive and people have been great to me. And to answer your question, I took a long way to get there. One of my better friends was a black German. His name was Hans-Joachim Massaquoi, who survived by miracle and his mother's help the Second World War in Germany. You know, there were millions of Jews killed in Germany, murdered in Germany, and he was one of the few black Germans. So the teachers always said to him, you know, Massaquoi, Now it's the Jews, the next one is you. And he said he grew up as a young boy in that kind of environment, being, he wanted, and he felt so German that he he wanted to volunteer to fight with the German Wehrmacht against the Russians. And when he went to the recruiting station, they said, Massacre, we take everyone, but not you. And he said, I didn't understand why not. I was not even aware I was black. I know I was black. So for this guy, for me, is a symbol of how great he can be, because he remained a very good human being. He went back to Germany all the time because he found good Germans also during this terrible time he lived. So he didn't give up on Germany. He didn't give up on the Germans. He gave up on these Germans who were horrible and criminal and despicable. But there was a black man, a black German, if today you would say an Afro-German, because that has changed also, that I have had also a great amount of sympathy for when I went to live in the United States. I had a great amount of sympathy for the today Afro-Americans, because I see how many of them were deprived of equality, were deprived of justice and a dignified life. And unfortunately, it hasn't changed. Unfortunately, in the United States today, there is racism. There is racism in Germany, naturally. There's racism in almost every country. But in the United States, it seems to me more than others. So I had good relationships, friendships with Black Americans, now African Americans. I was not a close friend of Muhammad Ali, but I knew Muhammad Ali when his name was Cassius Clay, and he had just refused to go to war in Vietnam, and he was then convicted to 5 years in prison, which he never had to do because the Supreme Court revoked the sentence. But I remained in touch, and I have had a very good relationship to him, not because he was Muhammad Ali, but he was a very nice, beautiful human being. And I had a good relationship with him, as I had with many others. For me, the question of black and white does not exist. For me, the question of Muslim, Catholic does not exist. I could care less whether you're Catholic, Jewish, or whatever you are. If you're a good man, that's fine. For me, I'm colorblind in many ways. And unfortunately, our societies are not. And it's tragic, but it's not a German phenomena. If you go outside in England, you don't have to go out in London, but you go to Birmingham or Nottingham or Bristol or whatever, and there's racism. And this racism is not based very often on knowledge. It's based on ignorance and not knowing the other culture, being afraid of the other culture, being afraid of people who come from Muslim nations like from Syria. And it's also unfair to see that if you're coming from Syria, if you come from Ethiopia or from Afghanistan to Europe, you're treated differently than when you come from Ukraine, because suddenly the visa situation doesn't exist for the people of Ukraine. I'm in favor of that. But I would think we should be more human and more understanding and more generous to the people who are escaping other dramatic areas of the world.
So you spoke about the return of the war in Europe, which is something that the Germans in particular are having a hard time to deal with in terms of their politics and their conception of the state and of foreign policy, whether Germany can be a full-fledged power with a military. There's also the question of borders today within the EU. Just in front of the EU, we have the risk of having a new Iron Curtain. There's some people that are arguing amongst themselves, Finland, arguing that we should cut the visas for Russians to Finland, for instance, so that they cannot access the EU. I wonder, in a world where there are conflicts between nations, do you think that people should still, Russians, for instance, be allowed to move freely within the EU, be granted visas, or do you think that people should be punished for the behavior of the states that is governing them?
It is a very, very good question, and it's a very, very difficult answer. I'm sure that many Russians, I don't know because I haven't been lately in Russia, or not very often anyway, I'm sure that there are many Russians who are against the war. I'm sure that there are many Russians who are not in agreement with Mr. Putin. So the question is, you want to punish all Russians because the government is an evil government. The question is how far you want to go. I mean, if you don't give them a visa, I don't think that many Russians want to come to Germany this time anywhere. And I don't know the situation in detail. I think it is a punishment, and visas or not visas should not be a punishment. And I think you have problems, for example, today in France, which are not giving visas easily to Moroccans. You have Spain, which doesn't give visas easily to Moroccans today, at least much less than before. And apparently this is for political reasons, for various political issues. But whom do you punish? You punish the people who love to go to France. You punish people who love to go to Italy. And you're not punishing the governments, you're punishing the people. And I think visas should not be an instrument of punishment. I can discuss and argue about sanctions because the tools we have to punish, in parentheses, Russia, they're limited. We don't want a war against Russia. We don't want a war against anybody. Then you say, how do we punish Russia? So you try with sanctions. As you said, then you try with visas. But that does not change the war situation. And that does not change the mind of Mr. Putin. And there is probably nothing which can change the mind of Mr. Putin unless his military forces will not have the success he dreams about, and that he will realize, hopefully soon, that his great dream of reorganizing the great Russia, the Tsarist Russia, or the Soviet Union, that this does not function anymore. This is not realizable anymore. I believe visas as a tool, to come back to that, is not working. It will not work. What does it work? It will make some Russians unhappy. And if they can't go to Germany, they go to Turkey. And if they can't travel to Venice, they will then go to Thailand, or they go to Bali, and they go to Bali and they go on vacation to other places. So, or they go to the South Pacific. The visas, I would just think is not a very good idea. Because we want people to be able to travel, and we want people to see that Germany is a democracy and not the country which we know from the Second World War. And we want the people to go to Arab countries like Morocco to see that it is possible to live a very interesting life in a Muslim country. Also with newspapers available to which criticize the government. And, we can also discuss democracy and the depth of democracy in each nation. But if you don't allow people to travel, they will remain ignorant and they will remain limited in their knowledge of the world.
Germany today, speaking of Germany, um, is at a crossroad a little bit in terms of how it's going to, um, you know, take the lead in Europe, including militarily, or whether it's going to stay this hybrid power between a very, very uh, incredible industry and yet a political presence internationally, which is quite shy. How do you see Germany evolving, including in terms of migration? Do you think that we will see more projection of Germany around the world, as a general thing?
Look, I am a child of history. I have experienced the aftermath of the Second World War, as I mentioned before. The great disaster of Germany as a nation, the great failure of the German people as a people. I have the feeling that there is no desire in Germany today by the younger generation to be dreaming about the Germany of influence. Germany's place, and that's nothing I invent myself, Germany's place is within Europe and within European borders. And whatever we can do in Europe, the Germans should do in the sense of being possibly more active on the level of defense expenditure, which they have recently changed. They are now projecting to give $100 billion of euros for defense issues. And I can agree with that, although I think the money could be spent elsewhere. But we live in a different realistic world. We have seen there are the Chinese maybe moving against Taiwan. The Russians are maybe moving against other countries in their neighborhood, who knows? So there has to be a kind of defense. But I think the German younger generation certainly does not aim to be influential. And the older generation has experienced and paid the price for their illusion of grandeur. And I hope that this will never happen again. And I believe it will never happen again. That there should be a participation of the Germans in the affairs of the world, yes, and the Germans are participating within the European Union. And the interesting thing is the same people who at one time said we should not rearm the Germans because they're evil in their spirit. The British were saying, the Germans play football like Panzer. The German teams were playing like Panzer groups. And there was always this illusion and relation to our German history. And then suddenly the Germans don't want to arm. They say, well, how can you don't want to arm? It's terrible. You have to go to the front. Now they suddenly say the Germans have to go to the front. I believe they should not go to the front. I think they should be participating in the European defense system. Hopefully there will be a European armed forces, but that'll take a long time because there are too many nations baking their own cakes. So no, I think the influence of Germany is limited to its economic power, and Germany is not a military nation.
What is your take? You're speaking about a European army. Do you consider yourself to be a federalist? How do you see?
You're speaking to a total European. I have lived, and you mentioned before, I speak a few languages. I also speak Italian because I lived in Italy. I lived in France. I traveled not to all countries of Europe, but particularly I don't know very well the Eastern European countries in Europe. But I like Europe, and I think Europe has a wonderful culture. I'm a European nationalist. I'm in favor of open borders. Since you're the boss of the Open Borders Institute, I have to emphasize I am in favor of open borders as much as possible. And I like Europe and all its differences. I like Scandinavia. I like Greece. I like Italy. I like Spain. I like Holland. I'm deeply, deeply, deeply sorry that London, that England, and the United Kingdom left the European Union. I think it's a historical disaster. It's a stupidity of the first degree, but I'm not British, so it's not up to me to decide. But I feel deeply sorry that the great spirit of Britain, which has been demonstrated in sport, in culture, in history, has disappeared to a large degree from Europe. And in a way, you could say we are now, I'm an orphan because England has disappeared. England has disappeared as an influential member of European affairs, and for the wrong reasons, in my opinion. But again, I say the British are adults, the British make their own decisions, they voted, and I'm a Democrat. I accept I'm not Trump, who since 2020 doubts that he lost the elections. The British have decided to leave Europe, and they have their reasons, and one has to accept it and try to find solutions which give England a chance also, because Brexit, if you look at figures today of economic performance, Brexit has not brought the great gifts to England, which Mr. Johnson and others have promised. And it will not come for a long time, unfortunately.
President Macron has spoken about a kind of Roman style inspired from history alliance with Britain, and also eventually with Ukraine. What do you think about that, about the EU's neighbors being involved in a kind of political alliance with the EU, informal one, not an extension of the European Union? What do you think about that?
Well, I have to say, Monsieur Macron has many ideas and is proposing many different things. The problem is to realize all these great thoughts you have. First thought we have to have is we have to try the end of Ukraine, the war in Ukraine. We have to we have to find a solution with Russia and Russia's allies, Belarus and others. We have to find a solution to find peace in Europe. And when we have found peace, which may take a long time, and trust, which will probably take forever, the terrible thing about this war is that nobody, as long as Putin is in power, will trust Monsieur Putin anymore. That's for sure. And if there is no trust in politics, if the treaties you sign are not worth the ink which has been used for these treaties, then it's useless to sign any treaties. And then it's useless to project new ideas, Roman Empire or Athens philosophy or whatever. It is now a time to find peace in Europe. And while Britain is sending arms to Ukraine, French are sending arms to Ukraine, the Germans are sending arms, everybody sends arms to Ukraine. As long as we do that, there is no peace. And as long as we do that, we should not even talk about other projects. We are unable to, because you are the Borders Institute, we are unable to protect the European borders. We are unable to find a human solution to migration coming to Europe. We are unable to agree, the French can't agree with the British of people escaping from France towards England. They can't agree how to stop this tragedy. The Europeans can't agree whether Greece should be supported or the Italians should be supported, because they have accepted almost more arrivals from North Africa than others. So if we can't find a solution to these very basic needs, then we shouldn't even talk about a Roman solution of the European structures. I believe we have to find, and I don't have the answer, unfortunately, how do you protect the borders of Europe without using arms, without sinking these boats? What is the human solution? Is there a Marshall Plan for Africa needed? Is there a Marshall Plan for whoever needed? How can you integrate people from Ethiopia, integrate from Asian countries? There's so many people trying to come to Europe, and there's so many people who believe that Europe is the solution. Europe is not the solution, and Europe is very, very much in trouble with the money people they have to absorb. If you think the Polish have 3 million Ukrainians on their land, the Germans have 900,000, the Germans have more than 1 million Syrians, the Germans have millions of Turks. Germany is a country of 10% of its population is Muslim, and I agree with that. And it's wonderful if they can be integrated. But integration means studying language. Integration means finding housing. Integration means finding schools. And then we do the $100 billion for defense. And then we have gas problems, and the Germans will freeze in the winter, and we have oil problems. There are so many problems that to absorb the African movement towards Europe is impossible. But what is the answer to that? I don't know. I don't know.
So there is the problematic at the southern border, Mediterranean border of the EU. There's also the question of Eastern enlargement. There has been a proposal for Ukraine to join the EU. What is your perspective on that?
First of all, what they're doing and proposing or accepting the demand of Ukraine to become member of the European Union is, first of all, it's theater now, because this is not the moment to discuss the acceptance of Ukraine into the European Union. They are very far away. Their criteria is very far away from how do you call answering to the demands of the European Union. What kind of economy they have, how much democracy they have. They are not there yet, the Ukrainians, to fulfill the demands of the European Union. So to say, yes, maybe you can join, it's very nice of them. Maybe it helps them in the spirit fighting this terrible war, but it's not a realistic proposal at this moment. It's like saying you have to become member of NATO, which would not be a very good idea at this moment either, to discuss these kind of things. We have to discuss and debate as a European Union credibly with Russia, and whenever the Russians are ready. They're not ready yet because their war aims have not been fulfilled. If Putin could stop the war tomorrow and say, okay, all these occupied areas are Russian now, then he would stop. But it's not guaranteed that this will happen. So we're living in a very time of great uncertainty, of instability, of questions, and politicians who believe they have the answers, they should go to Brussels, Washington, and Moscow and propose these answers. But we are far away from peace, unfortunately, and we are far away from simple solutions, because it's not only the European borders. If you look at the United States and you look what is happening at the southern border in the United States, what is happening at the borders of California, Arizona, and Texas at the United States, they don't have a chance. They have tried for a long time, the Americans, to stop the flow of refugees and migrants from San Salvador, Guatemala, and others. They have not succeeded. It is very difficult if you have mass movements trying to get across your borders, and they are trying and they're succeeding. It is very difficult. So it's not a European problem. There is a problem in the United States with borders. There are problems in borders in Africa, where people transgress into other borders because there is civil war. So we are living in a very destabilized world. But possibly the world always has been destabilized. But now we just know immediately by cell phone and internet what is happening and when it is happening. And we have the photographs and videos as Rajdi's, the attack on Rajdi. But 5 minutes later or 2 minutes later, the whole world will see what happens. And the Iranians, some Iranians say, wonderful, finally we got him. We live in a world of high speed and also, unfortunately, a TikTok generation of high ignorance.
On on this, I will end with a word about borders and peace, and you can react to that. You spoke about the problems of the EU with borders, but also in Africa. We hope that the situation in the Maghreb region between Morocco, Algeria, and its neighbors will find a solution in the coming years. It is very sad that people who are close historically happen to be on two sides of a wall that is closing many opportunities for Morocco. And so we hope at the Open Borders Institute that the coming years will see a peaceful solution be brought to the problem. If you want to.
If you say I can start and answer the last question, inshallah, and I can only say, people have tried, the United Nations have tried, governments have tried to find a solution for the Sahara. People have tried solutions to come to peace with Algeria. And it is a problem which is there, but it's the decision of the solutions is mainly between the two nations or several nations of Africa to find a solution, peaceful solution. Hopefully they will find it, but it may not take a few years, but it may take a very, very long time. And unfortunately, but at the moment, we are so preoccupied with so many other wars that the crisis between Morocco and Algeria seems almost from the outside as a footnote of history today.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you, Helmut.
Great pleasure. Hope to see you soon again. Bye-bye.